It wasn't an invasion or a revolution that brought China to its knees. It was a drug, a substance so profitable that Britain turned addiction into an empire, and so destructive that China fought 2 wars just to stop it. But how did a luxury trade between 2 world powers spiral into national collapse? And why couldn't China escape once it began? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're breaking down how a single drug helped bring down an empire. For centuries, China's wealth of natural resources and its advanced civilization enabled it to remain self-sufficient. It was a wonder of the world when Europeans began prolonged contact in the 16th century during the Age of Sail. China wasn't big on foreigners those days. It saw the Europeans as barbarians, but they kept on coming, knocking on the door, hoping for healthy trade relations. One of those knockers was the British, and in typical fashion, the relationship didn't get off to a good start. In 1637, Captain John Weddell, acting on behalf of a private English consortium, arrived with a 4-ship fleet off the coast of Macau, where the Portuguese had already established trade. In August, the British stormed a Chinese fort and hoisted the flag of St. George on a small island. Chinese authorities responded, ordering them to leave the waters of China peacefully and to never return. The Brits purchased sugar, gold, cloves, and ginger, but violence soon followed. Maybe the first formal skirmish between the English and the Chinese forces in history. Both sides took damage. The British only left after signing a pledge never to return, so definitely not a great start to Anglo-Sino trade relations. China didn't think it needed the outside world. After all, it had outpaced Europe in many areas of development. It led the world in astronomy, engineering, printing, gunpowder, and navigation. Its cities thrived with advanced agriculture, finance, and medicine. Even its philosophy and art were centuries ahead of their time. China was the whole package. It wasn't as if China hadn't seen any of the world. It had traded for centuries on the Silk Road, and it had once had its own maritime golden age during the early 15th century when its vast fleet sailed across the Indian Ocean. But unlike the Europeans who followed, China turned inward. Like the Japanese in the 1600s, who were also suspicious of Westerners and Bibles, it isolated itself. Under the Haijin, or seaborne policies, it restricted private maritime trade. By the 18th century, the so-called Canton system allowed contact with the West, but it was severely limited. Of course, that was met with resentment from Chinese merchants who wanted to make money, people who weren't fortunate enough to be born into the scholar official class. Some of them became smugglers, always ready to do business with foreign ships under the cover of darkness. The British were outraged. They saw themselves as champions of free trade, disciples of Adam Smith, the Scottish economist who had practically written the rule book for global capitalism. China was extremely rich, so why wouldn't it play ball? In the 1600s, it accounted for roughly a third of the entire world's GDP, with India about the same. By 1820, India's portion had declined, but China was still about 30%. Its economy was several times bigger than Britain's, even though Britain was then the most industrialized nation in Europe. As for the United States, it was a blip on the economic landscape. China's economy was about 20 times bigger. For those pro-trade Westerners, China's isolationist policies were almost criminal. It didn't even allow Europeans into the mainland, making traders stay in warehouses in Canton and denying them schools to learn Chinese. They limited contact with all regular Chinese people and only allowed trading in certain seasons under strict supervision. It was like being a pariah. But it wasn't surprising. China had watched the tides shifting across Asia. The British now ruled vast stretches of India, and they were tightening their hold on Malaya. The Dutch had seized Indonesia, and Western ships were appearing off the coasts of Burma and Vietnam. The old world was changing, carved up by empires that spoke of free trade, but did their talking down the barrel of a gun. Still, China stood apart. It regarded itself as the center of civilization. They weren't interested in the gifts Britain sent or the modernization that was promised with trade. Emperor Qianlong made his position crystal clear in 1793 when Britain asked for better trade terms. China, he said, already possessed everything it needed and had no use for British goods. It was a polite dismissal, but one delivered to a continent on the verge of an industrial revolution, soon to be producing weapons and machines far beyond anything China could match. The balance of power in the world was quietly shifting, and the Chinese didn't seem to appreciate this. The British wanted a lot, but mostly they wanted tea. Yes, tea. They were already addicted to it. While the common folk still drank ale, even at work, tea was the drink of choice for the upper and middle classes. It was refined, fashionable, and expensive. More importantly, it became one of the most profitable trades on earth. But there was a problem. China didn't want anything Britain had to offer, as explained by the emperor to King George. It didn't need British textiles or trinkets, only silver. So to buy tea, silk, and porcelain, the British East India Company had to pay in silver bullion. And that meant silver was constantly flowing out of Britain and into China. The balance of trade was heavily one-sided, what is called a trade deficit. Britain was importing far more than it exported, and their precious metal reserves were draining away. So how would they solve this? Simple: drug trafficking. The Brits had a new, powerful commodity that was being made by the ton in British-controlled India: opium. And the best part? Once someone started using it, stopping became almost impossible. The withdrawal was brutal and the cravings relentless. The Chinese population had consumed opium since the 8th century, but mostly for medicine. It was a much-needed pain relief during surgery or maybe even death by 1,000 cuts. Britain's idea was to flood China with the drug, and the trade deficit wouldn't seem so unfair. Of course, this was the Enlightenment era, and it didn't go unnoticed that trying to get a nation addicted to drugs was perhaps a little bit unethical. Many in Britain were against it. The Liberal politician and future Prime Minister, William Gladstone, told Parliament it was a disgrace. But for much of the nobility, for the many firms involved and their investors, it was a perfect storm in one of their China teacups. What began as a luxury vice of the wealthy and educated soon spilled over into every corner of society. In 1796, the emperor banned imports, but it didn't work. Then, in 1813, the Chinese effectively started the first war on drugs in history when they banned consumption, the penalty for possession being beaten 100 times. But when the Chinese cracked down, the British, and by now Americans, upped their game. The East India Company hired covert traders from the US and UK to do their business for them, effectively hiring traffickers. These men would usually anchor off the coast of Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, and sell to sketchy Chinese middlemen. The middlemen, numbering over 100 by 1830, used a network of boats and mules to get the opium to the mainland. Between 1810 and 1838, opium imports skyrocketed from 4,500 chests to nearly 40,000. Several million pounds of the stuff. What began as a side hustle had become a multi-million-dollar empire. Everything the Qing authorities tried proved futile. The British merchants learned every trick to dodge ship inspections. Meanwhile, Chinese dealers proved just as ingenious at slipping past imperial patrols. By some estimates, around 30% of the entire Chinese population, from peasants to scholars, had become addicted to British opium. Chinese authorities started raiding opium dens and punishing users, but when a third of the country's addicted, they couldn't start locking up everyone. And that's when officials began to consider a different approach. Some suggested legalizing and taxing it, make opium more expensive, curb demand, and fill the treasury at the same time. But the moralists won the debate, those who argued that addiction was pure evil. It tore apart families, it rotted society from within, turned peasants idle, students unfocused, and soldiers weak. They might have been right, but in hindsight, the other side's solution may have been much better in the long run. Even though they arrested about 1,600 Chinese dealers and threw tens of thousands of opium pipes into fires, it didn't do much to reduce addiction rates. The business was just too lucrative not to get involved. By 1839, Britain was selling enough opium to pay for every pound of tea it imported. China, once a magnificent nation, although plagued with corruption and elite infighting, was going out of its mind. Society was being destroyed from within. And that's when the Daoguang Emperor turned to scholar official Lin Zexu, ordering him to take action, and this time to appeal directly to the British Crown. Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her to stop this poisonous trade that is ravaging his country. He said if it carries on, China would no longer have a military to protect itself from invaders. The letter never even reached her, but even if it had, it surely wouldn't have mattered. There simply was too much money at stake. Still, some of the Brits who had seen the damage were critical. The issue sparked a fierce public debate. Most agreed the trade was immoral and it had to end, or at the very least, the booming international narcotics trade needed to be regulated. Back in China, the letter had failed, so had the crackdowns. China, frustrated and feeling disrespected by Britain's disregard for their laws and culture, took drastic action. They quarantined Canton, seizing over 2.6 million pounds of the drug. They destroyed it all, an entire fortune's worth of opium belonging to a nation that had just built some of the most advanced warships on Earth. Charles Elliot, the chief superintendent of British trade with China, saw war looming on the horizon. Something had to change. He insisted that the British investors and traffickers back in London had to be compensated. Nothing came. British politicians, convinced that China's refusal to open its markets was a deliberate insult to free trade, began talking of force. It was moral outrage, not the kind of thing civilized men were supposed to do. But beneath the outrage, some saw an opportunity, a chance to go to war and prove who really held the power now. In August 1839, after 2 British sailors killed a Chinese villager in a drunken brawl, Lin Seisu imposed a food embargo on 60 British ships anchored off of Kowloon. The British refused to hand over the culprits, which Lin saw as a blatant violation of China's sovereignty. By September, the first shots of the Opium War were fired. British ships clashed with Chinese junks, driving them off after a brief skirmish. The British got their supplies, but the reports that reached Beijing told a very different story. One of the British ships sunk and heavy losses inflicted. It was fiction, but it fueled Beijing's belief that victory was within their reach. In those days, China had a very top-down society, and occasionally officials told their bosses what they wanted to hear. In 1840, Queen Victoria said she was giving the issue her full attention. In Britain, the debate raged. Some politicians claimed China had only itself to blame, especially after expelling British traders from Canton. Others warned that the war would be a moral stain. In the end, Parliament was almost evenly split, 271 to 262, a narrow vote for war. That June, a British expeditionary force arrived off Canton, 16 warships, 4 steam-powered gunboats, and 25 support vessels. The British came with a list of demands. They wanted compensation for the destroyed opium, payments for the cost of war, new ports for British trade, and tariffs set on British terms. The Qing authorities in Canton were not exactly thrilled. Over the next 2 years, the British unleashed their modern navy and artillery on coastal fortifications, bombarding and capturing one stronghold after another. The Qing armies, brave but poorly armed and uncoordinated, were no match. British troops, veterans of imperial wars across the globe, fought with discipline and devastating firepower. These were men who had lived and breathed war. They were the very best at it, with weapons superior to anything the Chinese had. It was during this campaign that Britain unveiled a terrifying symbol of this new industrial power, the iron-hulled steam warship Nemesis. The ship tore through Chinese defenses with ease and played a decisive role in the capture of Canton in early 1841. Despite Emperor Daoguang's attempts, British forces pressed north, sailing up the Yangtze River and seizing Nanking. It was a devastating humiliation for the Qing dynasty, proof that China's centuries of isolation and technological complacency had left it exposed. The Chinese had never stood a chance. Thousands were killed in battle, while Britain's losses were minimal, only a few dozen men in combat. Had the war dragged on, British troops would have likely swept through the entire empire, leaving a trail of blood and shame on a nation that had once thought itself invincible. Under the resulting Treaty of Nanking in 1842, Hong Kong was ceded to the British Crown. China was forced to pay $21 million in reparations, compensation for the war, for lost opium, and for British merchants' claims. The treaty opened 5 new ports to British trade and imposed favorable tariffs. It granted extraterritorial rights to foreigners, allowing them to live under their own laws in cities like Shanghai, which soon became a hub of Western commerce and influence. The treaty marked the beginning of China's century of humiliation, a period of foreign domination and internal decay. It shattered the prestige of the Qing dynasty and fueled a growing wave of nationalism. To make matters worse, opium imports didn't stop. They went through the roof. The British later legalized the trade. By 1879, British opium imports in China had reached 87,000 chests, far higher than before the war. It then accounted for about 17% of the money earned in British India, helping the British to keep control there, their jewel in the crown. It also made individual fortunes like those of Scotsman William Jardine and James Matheson, who founded Jardine Matheson & Co., a trading empire that still exists today as a Fortune Global 500 company. American merchants profited too, men who would go on to become some of the richest industrialists in the country. Their names now plastered on schools, museums, and hospitals. One of them, Robert Bennett Forbes, ancestor of the now super-rich Forbes family, wrote in private letters that he'd made a killing. He felt no shame about, in his own words, demoralizing millions of Chinese workers and draining the country of money. It was what it was. The trade also meant that opium spread all over the USA. It was popular in the Wild West during the gold rush, spreading to San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Denver, Chicago, and New York. A second Opium War broke out in 1856. When it ended in 1860 after British and French forces captured Beijing, China faced humiliation once again. It was forced to sign a new wave of unequal treaties, paying huge indemnities and opening even more ports to foreign powers. China had been devastated. The country was now overrun with Westerners, its officials living in disgrace, and the trade treaties signed under duress were bleeding it dry. The Japanese, a people China had long viewed as inferior, had not remained so isolated. More open to Western ideas and trade, it had modernized rapidly, building a military modeled on European standards. By the mid-1890s, its modern army crushed China in the First Sino-Japanese War, seizing Taiwan and parts of Manchuria. Inside China, the situation was chaotic. Civilians had lost all trust in the Qing rulers, who were already blamed for the country's poverty and humiliation. Anger boiled over in the Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-foreign uprising that called for expelling all outsiders. About 32,000 Chinese Christians were massacred, some buried alive, and around 200 Western missionaries and officials were killed. It gave foreign powers the perfect excuse for another intervention. An alliance of troops from Britain, the United States, Austria-Hungary, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Russia invaded China. In Beijing, huge crowds gathered supporting the government and demanding the foreigners expelled. Some Qing officials secretly backed them, others feared disaster. The so-called Boxers, once believed to possess mystical powers that made them bulletproof, were mostly just desperate peasants. Poor, badly armed men lashing out in a country that was being destroyed. China had been carved up. Historians would later call it the scramble for China. The British had started it, but by then every major power wanted a piece, and they were often brutal. When Chinese citizens protested against German railways, the Germans shot them in cold blood, even as missionaries were spreading the good word of Jesus to the savages. The Boxers and the Qing imperial forces didn't stand a chance. At the Battle of Tientsin, 6,900 Allied soldiers overcame a much bigger force and captured Beijing. European and American forces went on the warpath, murdering civilians, abusing women, engaging in widespread looting, burning down houses, with families still inside. German, Russian, and Japanese forces were said to have walked into villages and massacred everyone. Hundreds of women decided it was better not to live than face the troops. Reports got back to Europe, saying soldiers had mutilated the corpses. One American general who tried to stop the looting wrote that for every Boxer killed, 50 innocent people were slaughtered. Mark Twain was similarly outraged, writing that the so-called civilizing countries were acting like brutes. It ended with the Boxer Protocol, a peace treaty in which China again had to pay enormous sums, indemnities to all 8 nations, there were mass executions, and an agreement that foreign forces could be stationed all over China. The country had now been subjugated, battered up with treaties signed under the threat of violence. Many Westerners still believed that China was to blame for closing itself off to what was a new globalism. But the century of humiliation wasn't quite over. After World War I, China sent men to Europe to aid the Allied war effort, hoping to regain some international respect. But when the Allies ignored China's plea for self-determination and handed its territories to Japan instead, the betrayal ran deep. It fueled anger toward Western imperialism, and it helped spark the nationalist and revolutionary movements that would reshape China's future. More pain came in the 1930s and 40s. China suffered tremendously in World War II, when millions were slaughtered at the hands of the Japanese, who committed vile war crimes, especially against women. The war ended with China on the winning side, but in 1949 it was the enemy of the West again, when Mao Zedong beat the nationalists in the Chinese Communist Revolution. Mao told his people never again, but his determination to industrialize China at breakneck speed through the Great Leap Forward meant catastrophe followed. Millions, perhaps tens of millions, died in one of the worst famines in human history. Countless citizens were also beaten to death and executed, with Chinese archives showing unparalleled brutality, even cannibalism. Then, in Mao's Cultural Revolution, when he fully developed his cult of personality, millions more were killed, often by ideological students who were more than willing to cause suffering to signal their revolutionary virtue. But from the ashes of a failed policy rose a giant. Chinese statesman Deng Xiaoping opened the country up to the world through the open door policy in 1978, embracing international trade but holding on to China's unique style of government, capitalism with communist-style limits on speech and expression, sometimes brutal but nothing like before. Economically and psychologically, China was rejuvenated. It was no longer the sick man of Asia. In the decades that followed Xiaoping's policies, an estimated 850 million people were lifted out of poverty. Living standards soared. Healthcare improved. The country achieved what economists call the greatest economic miracle in modern history. In 1997, Hong Kong was returned from Britain, and today China's Belt and Road Initiative extends to more than 3/4 of the globe. The Opium War may barely be mentioned in Western classrooms, even in Britain, but in China it remains a very painful scar. It defines how the nation sees itself and the world. When President Xi Jinping invokes wolf warrior diplomacy, it resonates with a population raised on the memories of their forebears' humiliation at the hands of foreign powers, when the country was, quote, plunged into an abyss of great suffering. China has made sure its military will never fall behind again. The real question now is whether it'll keep to its policy of non-intervention or begin projecting its power far beyond its borders. The United States doubts it'll stay on the sidelines, and history shows that great powers, once they rise, rarely do. China's Opium Wars was the beginning of its collapse, but an even darker chapter followed. Watch why Mao Zedong was the most brutal tyrant to see how his rule changed the nation forever. Or click on this video instead.